"Do you believe in ghosts?" The old man's voice echoed in Emily's mind as she drove up the winding road, the dense forest pressing in from both sides. He had said it with a chilling certainty, as if the existence of the supernatural was as obvious as the sun in the sky. But Emily wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. Until now, the Whittaker Mansion had been abandoned for nearly 50 years, but its haunting legacy never died. The locals said that once you entered, you never left the same, if you left at all. Most townsfolk avoided even speaking of it, but Emily had heard just enough rumors to make her curious. As a history major with a penchant for mysteries, this decaying, forgotten mansion was exactly the kind of place she had been dreaming of exploring. But as she reached the crumbling gates of the estate, a strange sense of unease settled over her. The air was heavy, too quiet. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just stillness. She pulled the car to a stop, her heart beating faster than she expected. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped out of the car and stood before the imposing mansion. Its windows were dark, gaping like hollow eyes watching her. The front doors, once grand, now stood slightly ajar as if inviting her inside, or daring her. The sky, once bright with the colors of sunset, was now swallowed by dark clouds, casting a gloom over the property. In the fading light, the mansion looked more like a tomb. Emily grabbed her flashlight and camera. She would be in and out in an hour, just enough time to gather footage for her university project. As she approached the front door, her hand hesitated on the handle. She could still hear the old man's voice in her head. "Once you enter the Whittaker Mansion, it doesn't let you go." She shook off the chill creeping down her spine and pushed the door open. The loud creak echoed through the hollow halls, and for a moment, Emily swore she heard footsteps above her. But when she looked up, nothing was there. Just the empty, decaying grandeur of a forgotten home. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. She shone her flashlight down the hallway, the beam catching glimpses of old portraits lining the walls. The Whittaker family, once one of the wealthiest in the region. But tragedy had struck this house, and it was said that none of them had left alive. Her heart thudded loudly in the silence as she whispered into her camera, her voice shaking more than she wanted to admit. Whittaker Mansion, October 13th. People say this house is cursed, that the spirits of the Whittaker family still roam these halls waiting. She paused, swallowing hard. In the distance, she thought she heard something. A faint tapping, like fingers brushing against the walls. "I'm here to find out if there's any truth to the stories." Emily's voice cracked as she continued recording her footage. She took a slow step forward, her flashlight cutting through the dust-heavy air, illuminating peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered across the floor. The mansion felt like it had been frozen in time, almost like the house itself was waiting for something, or someone. She turned down a narrow corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. The portraits lining the walls seemed to stare at her, their eyes following her every move. One of them, a young woman with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes, seemed especially haunting. Emily paused in front of it, tilting her head, her breath catching in her throat. There was something unsettling about the woman's expression. It was almost like the figure in the painting knew something she didn't. Suddenly, the tapping sound echoed through the house again, louder this time. Emily froze, gripping her flashlight tighter, the beam shaking in her trembling hands. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper within the mansion. It wasn't just the house settling. It was deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. She felt ridiculous speaking into the darkness, but the silence that followed her words was even more unnerving. The tapping stopped, and the air grew even colder. Emily could feel the temperature drop so fast. It was as if the house itself was exhaling icy breath down her neck. She shivered, hugging her arms around herself as she moved forward. She had only taken a few more steps when the lights on her camera flickered and died. Panic shot through her, and she scrambled to hit the buttons, hoping to reboot the system. But it was no use. The screen remained black, the buttons unresponsive. Her only source of light now was her flashlight, and even that seemed dimmer than before. A sense of dread washed over her. Something wasn't right. That's when she saw it. A shadow moving at the far end of the hall. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But as she focused, she could see it. Someone was standing there. A woman. She was barely visible in the darkness. Her figure blurred and distorted. But there was no mistaking it. Emily's breath hitched as the figure stepped closer. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but there was something disturbingly familiar about her posture. Emily's heart raced as the realization hit her like a wave of ice. This wasn't a person. Couldn't be. It was the woman from the painting. The woman's face remained hidden as she moved closer, her feet gliding silently across the floor as if she weren't walking at all. Emily stumbled backward, her pulse roaring in her ears. Her back hit the wall, and she tried to turn, but her body felt frozen, paralyzed by fear. The shadow woman stopped just a few feet away, and for the first time Emily could see her face, her eyes, black as night, her skin pale and cracked like porcelain. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she whispered something, so faint that it was barely audible. "Help me!" Emily blinked in shock, her breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The woman's voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, before it's too late." Before Emily could process what was happening, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of her plea lingering in the air. Suddenly, Emily felt a sharp, icy breeze whip past her, and the hallway lights flickered. She bolted, her feet pounding against the creaky floorboards as she ran back down the hallway, toward the front door. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart pounded in her chest. But no matter how fast she ran, it felt like the mansion itself was growing longer, stretching the halls into endless darkness. She reached the grand foyer, her hands trembling as she pushed against the heavy door. But it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, like something was holding it closed from the other side. "Let me out!" Emily screamed, her voice breaking. She pounded on the door, her fingers scraping against the wood in desperation. Suddenly, a voice spoke softly behind her, low and chilling. "You were warned." Emily froze, turning slowly. The figure of an old man stood in the shadows, his face partially hidden by the dim light filtering through the broken windows. He was tall and gaunt, his skin gray and lifeless. "I told you, the mansion doesn't let you go." Emily's vision blurred as tears of terror welled in her eyes. Please let me out. I didn't mean to." "You've already disturbed them," the old man said, his voice a haunting whisper. "Now they're awake." The air around her shifted, and Emily felt a presence. Something unseen but undeniably there, creeping closer. The temperature dropped further, her breath coming out in icy puffs. She spun around to find the portraits of the Whittaker family lining the walls again. But this time, their faces were different. The once regal and stoic expressions were now twisted into grotesque grins, their eyes following her with sinister intent. Emily backed away, her heart slamming against her ribcage, but the whispers began again, louder and more insistent this time. They were all around her, voices overlapping, growing into a cacophony of torment. "Stay! Join us!" Emily clutched her head, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more demanding. "Forever!" The whispers clawed at Emily's mind, swirling in a maddening storm around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to shut them out, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "Stay! Forever!" She stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering erratically, casting long, shifting shadows across the grand foyer. The portraits on the walls seemed to warp and twist as the house came alive with their whispered demands. The faces of the Whittaker family, once still, morphed into grotesque, sneering masks, their eyes hollow, their mouths moving as if trying to speak. Emily spun around, frantically searching for another way out. Her pulse raced, every beat echoing in her ears. She spotted a staircase leading to the second floor. It was a reckless move, but the overwhelming sense that something was closing in behind her left her no choice. She bolted for the stairs, nearly tripping over her own feet in her panic. The wooden steps creaked ominously beneath her weight, each one groaning like the house was protesting her presence. She glanced behind her, just for a second, and saw it, a dark figure at the base of the stairs, standing still, watching her. The old man. His expression was unreadable. His eyes locked on her as she fled up the stairs, his shadow stretching unnaturally long, following her like a predator. Emily's throat tightened in fear as she reached the top of the staircase, her legs burning from the sprint. She darted down the narrow hallway, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The hallway seemed impossibly long, the doors on either side closed and silent. She could hear something, footsteps behind her, but when she turned, the hallway was empty. Her hand gripped the handle of the first door she reached. It didn't budge. Locked. She tried another. Locked. Panic surged through her chest as she went to the next door. Her shaking hands fumbled with the handle, and to her relief, it opened with a loud creak. She threw herself into the room and slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling fingers. She leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing, but it felt like the walls were closing in. The room was dimly lit by a single candle on a small wooden table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Emily's eyes scanned the room. It was small and sparse, a bedroom with an old four-poster bed draped in moth-eaten curtains. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. But what caught her attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was large, its glass fogged with age, but there was something about it that made her uneasy. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. As she moved closer, she saw her reflection, pale, wide-eyed, her hair disheveled from her frantic escape. But something wasn't right. In the reflection, there was someone else standing behind her. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure in the mirror was faint at first, like a shadow barely visible in the fogged glass. But as she watched, it became clearer. A woman. The same woman from the painting. The one with hollow eyes and a twisted, malevolent smile. Emily turned to look behind her, but the room was empty. The woman was only in the mirror. The reflection's smile widened, and then, without warning, the woman moved. Emily screamed as the figure in the mirror lunged forward, her hands pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, distorting the image as the woman's twisted, ghostly face pressed closer. Her hollow eyes bored into Emily's, her smile growing wider and more grotesque. Desperation flooded Emily's mind. She had to get out. She had to escape before whatever was in the mirror came for her. She backed away from the mirror, her body trembling with fear. But as she reached for the door, it began to rattle. Someone or something was on the other side. The handle twisted violently, and the door shook on its hinges as if someone was trying to force it open. Emily backed into the corner of the room, her hands over her mouth to stifle her sobs. She could feel the coldness in the air intensify, the temperature plummeting as the door buckled under the pressure. Suddenly, the door flew open with a deafening crash, and there, standing in the doorway, was the old man. His eyes were cold, lifeless, and he stepped into the room with a slow, deliberate pace. "I told you," he rasped, his voice a chilling whisper. "You've woken them. Now you'll never leave." Emily's vision blurred with terror, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She backed further into the corner, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the old man advanced on her. His shadow seemed to stretch across the floor, growing larger, more menacing. The whispers started again, louder this time. All around her, they echoed, bouncing off the walls, filling her head with their dark, insidious words. "Stay! Join us! Forever!" The old man's face twisted into a cruel grin as he reached out toward her. Emily's body tensed, her instincts screaming at her to fight, to flee. Anything to escape the horror closing in around her. But before she could move, something shifted in the room. The air grew heavy, thick with a presence that was both ancient and powerful. Emily felt it. Something far older, far darker than the spirits that haunted this house. The old man stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening with fear. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then, with a bone-chilling wail, he was dragged backward, pulled into the shadows by an unseen force. His screams echoed through the room, growing fainter and fainter until there was only silence. Emily stood frozen, her mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her entire body was shaking, her heart hammering in her chest. But she knew one thing. She had to get out. Now, Emily's pulse was a roar in her ears. Her legs felt like lead, her body unwilling to move from the corner where she had watched the old man be swallowed by the shadows. But somewhere deep inside her, the primal instinct to survive pushed her to action. She had to leave. This house wasn't just haunted by restless spirits. It was alive, feeding on fear, and she was its next victim. Stumbling toward the door, Emily risked a glance over her shoulder. The mirror's surface had returned to normal, no trace of the ghostly woman or the rippling glass. But the memory of the twisted reflection haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling that even if she escaped the room, whatever was in that mirror was still watching her. She bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind her, hoping it would buy her a few precious seconds. The hallway seemed impossibly long again, the doors on either side looming like the gaping maws of beasts ready to swallow her whole. The whispers followed her, growing louder, angrier, as if the house itself was furious with her attempt to flee. She ran toward the stairs, her heart pounding, but as she reached the landing, she saw something that made her stop cold. The front door, the one she had entered through, was gone. Where there had once been a way out, there was now only a solid wall, old and worn with cracks snaking through the plaster. Panic surged through her, her eyes scanning the foyer for another exit. The windows were dark, their glass fogged and impenetrable, as if the outside world had been swallowed up by the house. "No, no, no, no," she muttered, her voice trembling. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as she frantically searched for another way out. Another staircase, this one leading down to what looked like a cellar. It wasn't ideal, but it was her only option. She hesitated for a moment, dread pooling in her stomach. The cellar, underground, dark, the perfect place for something to hide. But she had no choice. The voices were closing in, surrounding her, filling her mind with their dark promises. If she stayed up here, they would find her, and there would be no escape. Taking a deep breath, Emily ran toward the cellar stairs. The air grew colder as she descended, her feet moving faster and faster as if driven by the unseen force of terror chasing her. The walls seemed to close in, and the narrow staircase spiraled downward far longer than it should have. It didn't make sense. She should have reached the bottom by now, but the stairs kept going. The whispers became louder, more menacing, and she could feel the presence again. The same one that had dragged the old man into the shadows. Emily's body screamed for her to stop, to turn back, but there was nowhere to go. She had to keep moving forward. Finally, the stairs opened into a dark, stone-walled chamber. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the stench of decay. Her flashlight flickered, casting shaky beams of light on the floor. It was wet, puddles of dark liquid, thick and sticky. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. In the middle of the room was a large, iron door. It looked ancient, its surface rusted and covered in strange, illegible markings. Emily's heart sank at the sight of it, a sickening sense of dread clawing at her chest. She could feel it. Whatever was behind that door was worse than anything she had encountered in this house so far. But she had no choice. There was nowhere else to go, no other way out. She stepped toward the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. Her fingers barely brushed the cold metal when the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, suffocating. It pressed in on her from all sides, the weight of the house's malevolence bearing down on her. For a moment, there was nothing, just Emily, the door, and the suffocating darkness. And then she heard it, a faint, scraping sound. From behind the door, Something was moving on the other side. Slowly, deliberately, Emily's breath hitched in her throat. She backed away from the door, her heart racing, her mind screaming at her to run. But before she could turn, the door creaked open on its own, just a crack. A soft, cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of something dragging across the stone floor. Emily's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. She fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to turn on the flashlight app. The dim light from her phone cast weak beams across the chamber, just enough for her to see the door fully open now. And something was coming out of it. It was slow, deliberate, and the air around it seemed to distort, warping the very space it passed through. Emily's stomach churned as she realized what it was. The figure was not fully formed. It was like a mass of darkness, shifting and writhing as it pulled itself through the doorway, its limbs long and unnatural, its face a blur of features that didn't make sense. It wasn't human. It was something far older, far darker than any spirit or ghost. And it was coming for her. Emily backed up, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had no idea where to go, no way to escape. She could feel the coldness radiating from the thing, the malevolent force pressing against her skin, chilling her to the bone. Her phone slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor, its light flickering out. She was alone in the darkness with the thing. She closed her eyes, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath shallow and rapid. She had to think. She had to find a way out. But the oppressive darkness pressed in on her, suffocating her, clouding her mind. The thing was close now. She could feel its presence looming over her, its cold breath brushing against the back of her neck. And then, in the darkness, she heard a voice. But this time it wasn't the whispers. It was clear, sharp, and right in her ear. "Emily, you should never have come here." Her eyes snapped open, and there, in front of her, was the face of the woman from the mirror. Her eyes hollow, her twisted smile wide and grotesque. The woman reached out, her cold, ghostly fingers brushing against Emily's face, and everything went black.